Tashonda was born in 1970, and she grew up in the quiet, rural heart of Barnwell, South Carolina. In many ways, she represented the promise and vibrancy of young adulthood in a community where opportunities were often limited. She was still carving out her own path, carrying with her the hopes that so many young people in the rural South carried. Dreams of something bigger, something brighter beyond the boundaries of small-town life. She grew up in a world defined by small-town rhythms, where everyone seemed to know one another and where the future, though uncertain, always held the promise of something brighter. Barnwell was the kind of place where family ties ran deep, where church bells marked the weeks, and where young girls like Tashonda dreamed of stepping beyond the narrow borders of their town. From childhood, she carried with her a spark of energy and warmth. Those who knew her remembered her as friendly, with a smile that seemed to make people feel at ease. She came of age in the 1980s, a decade when America was brimming with change. Pop culture was vibrant, fashion was bold, and technology was beginning to weave its way into everyday life. Yet in Barnwell, life moved at a slower pace. Opportunities for young people, especially young women of color, were often limited. Many worked hard in school and leaned on family and community, all while hoping to create a life that broke free from the generational hardships that lingered in the South. By the time she was 19, Tashonda was on the cusp of adulthood. She was navigating the same questions most young people face: what path to take, where life might lead, and who could be trusted in a world that wasn't always forgiving. On a fateful day in 1990, Tashonda went missing, sending ripples of worry through those who loved her. Days passed without word, and then one day, the police find a body in a pond near Barnwell. It was Tashonda's. The police investigators determined she had been strangled and then submerged into the water. For the community, her death was almost too heavy to confront. Small towns can carry big silences, and in Barnwell, silence wrapped itself around her story. The tragedy was mourned, yet unanswered questions lingered. Without answers, the case faded into the background.
Please help us make 1,000 subscribers by the year end. Make sure to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and leave comments down below so I can find out what content you'd like to see, and I will reply to everyone. Don't forget to hit the bell to be notified as soon as the next video drops.
Caroline Love's story begins in 1969, born into a family rooted in the heart of the Carolinas. From her earliest days, she was known for her quiet determination, the kind of young woman who approached life with steady resolve and a gentle warmth that drew people close. She grew up during the 1970s, a decade alive with cultural shifts, when music, fashion, and dreams of opportunity swirled even in the modest corners of Southern life. For Caroline, education was her guiding light. She had a vision of building a future that reached beyond the limitations of her hometown, and she worked tirelessly to pursue it. Her family remembered her as someone who carried herself with grace and responsibility. She was the type of daughter who could be relied upon, the type of sister whose laughter softened the room. By the time she reached her early 20s, she had enrolled in college and was carving out her independence in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city transforming rapidly in the early 1990s. Charlotte, then, was a city of contrasts. Skyscrapers of banks and booming businesses gleamed in the uptown district, symbols of progress and wealth. Yet surrounding neighborhoods told another story, one of hardworking families trying to find their footing in a fast-changing world. It was in this atmosphere of opportunity and uncertainty that Caroline pursued her studies, working while attending school, balancing the weight of adulthood with the promise of dreams just beginning to take shape. In July of 1992, the path of her life took a tragic turn. Caroline failed to return home one evening, and her absence immediately sent waves of worry through her loved ones. Friends and family searched, clung to hope, and prayed for answers. But as days stretched into weeks, that hope began to waver. The search came to a heartbreaking conclusion when she was found years later, her body discovered in an abandoned apartment in Charlotte. It was the summer of 1992 when the Charlotte police first received the missing person report for Caroline Love. She had vanished without warning, and while missing adults often left law enforcement balancing the line between foul play and voluntary disappearance, something about Caroline's case struck differently. She was reliable, rooted in her routines, deeply tied to her family and studies. Vanishing into silence was out of character. Her loved ones pressed the urgency, and the investigation began. For weeks, detectives canvassed her neighborhood, questioned friends, retraced her last known steps. Flyers went up, interviews were taken, but no solid leads emerged. Her absence began to weigh heavily, not just on her family, but on the officers handling the case. Still, without evidence of a crime, Caroline's disappearance lingered in limbo, filed as one of the many haunting mysteries in a growing city. Then, nearly 2 years later, in March of 1994, the silence was broken. Acting on new information, police searched an abandoned apartment complex in Charlotte. The building stood quiet, its windows dark, its halls echoing with the kind of emptiness that unsettles even seasoned detectives. Inside one of the apartments, concealed beneath the weight of time and neglect, they found what they had long feared, but could not prove: the remains of a young woman. The discovery was grim. Time had taken its toll, yet the evidence spoke clearly enough. This was the body of Caroline Love, the young college student who had vanished so abruptly. For investigators, the moment was devastating. The hope of finding her alive was gone, replaced by the heavy responsibility of piecing together the truth of her final hours. In that small, abandoned space, detectives felt the gravity of what had happened. They were no longer chasing a missing person case. They were standing in the aftermath of a murder. Caroline's family, who had endured nearly 2 years of uncertainty, now faced the devastating reality of loss. For the city of Charlotte, her discovery deepened a sense of unease, the gnawing realization that something dark was moving quietly through their community. The police account of that day remains etched in the record as the turning point when suspicion shifted from disappearance to homicide. It was a solemn moment, the kind of discovery that reinforces both the fragility of life and the tireless weight of justice left undone. Sharon Nance's story begins in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she was born and raised during a period of both promise and struggle for her community. She came of age in the 1970s, a time when the city was beginning its transformation from a southern town into a bustling financial hub. For many families like Sharon's, life was not easy, but it was rooted in resilience. Sharon grew up with a strong sense of independence. Friends described her as outgoing, someone who carried herself with confidence even when times were difficult. By her late 20s, Sharon was navigating the challenges of adulthood in a world that was not always forgiving. Charlotte in the early 1990s was a city of stark contrasts. Uptown glittered with skyscrapers and bank towers, while in the surrounding neighborhoods, economic hardship was common. Sharon's life was shaped by this tension between opportunity and struggle, hope and survival. She was resourceful, determined to get by, and always searching for a better way forward. On the night of May 20th, 1992, Sharon's path turned toward tragedy. That evening, she was last seen near a stretch of road where traffic was sparse and shadows stretched long under the streetlights. For reasons no one would ever fully know, she crossed paths with danger. When Sharon failed to return home, worry spread among those who knew her. But in a city where disappearances did not always make headlines, her absence passed quietly at first. It wasn't until the early morning hours that her fate was discovered. A passerby noticed something unusual near a deserted section of roadway, a shape on the ground, still and lifeless. The call was made to Charlotte police, and officers arrived swiftly. Under the glow of their flashlights, they found the body of a woman, later identified as Sharon Nance. She had suffered blunt force trauma, and the scene made clear that she had been attacked violently. Detectives secured the area, marking the lonely roadside with crime scene tape. The silence of the night was broken only by the hum of radios and the scribble of pens as officers documented every detail. Forensic investigators combed the scene, searching for anything that might explain what had happened to her or who could have been responsible. Yet the evidence was sparse, the trail already cold in the damp night air. Sharon's death sent ripples through her community. She was not just a statistic or a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman whose life mattered. Her story, like so many others, was a reminder that violence does not discriminate between the hopeful and the struggling, between the dreamers and the weary. She had started life with the same promise as anyone, only to meet her end on a quiet road under the cover of night. Long before Henry Louis Wallace's name was linked to the crimes that would haunt Charlotte, he was seen as an ordinary man, someone capable of love, commitment, and family. Beneath the darkness that defined his later years, there existed a quieter chapter of his life, one that few people now remember: his marriage. It was, in many ways, a portrait of deception, a relationship that began with hope but would ultimately exist in the shadow of secrets. In 1985, while serving in the U.S. Navy, Wallace married a woman named Moretta Brabham. To those around them, they seemed like a young couple with promise. He wore the crisp uniform of a sailor, and she, by all accounts, was deeply devoted to him. Together, they appeared steady and loving, a partnership built on the kind of shared dreams that defined so many early marriages. Friends described Wallace as attentive and charming, a man who spoke softly and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. But even then, cracks were forming beneath the surface. Wallace struggled with discipline and responsibility, traits that would follow him throughout his life. His military career began to falter due to misconduct and a growing dependency on drugs. While Moretta tried to hold their marriage together, she would later come to see the same inconsistencies that would one day define his downfall. The lies, the double life, the manipulation hidden beneath that calm exterior. Their marriage was marked by constant movement and uncertainty. Wallace's time in the Navy took them from one place to another, but stability never followed. Eventually, his behavior grew erratic, and trust began to erode. The charm that had first drawn her in became a weapon, used to excuse his absences, his temper, and his growing detachment. By the time they separated in the early 1990s, Wallace had already begun to drift toward the life that would consume him. After the marriage ended, Wallace returned to Charlotte, alone but outwardly unbroken. He still presented himself as the same personable man he had always been, the kind who could make friends easily and seem genuinely caring. But behind the facade, the loneliness and resentment had deepened. He had no real connection left, no marriage, no grounding, no direction. Those who knew him at the time said he talked fondly about his past, about his wife, even as his actions suggested a man unraveling. As for children, there are no confirmed biological children known to be fathered by Wallace. Throughout his adult life, he was surrounded by young families and often around children, his victims' siblings, nieces, and, in some heartbreaking cases, their babies. But Wallace himself never became a father. In that absence, perhaps, was another layer of his fractured identity, a man who could play the role of friend, employee, or confidant, but who could not truly nurture or connect in the way he pretended. His failed marriage stands as one of the earliest signs of his double life, the split between the image he showed the world and the man he truly was. To his wife, he was complicated but human. To the city that would later know his name, he was something else entirely. Henry Louis Wallace and his wife, Moretta Brabham, officially divorced in 1992. The exact month of their separation and legal divorce isn't clearly documented in public records, but it's known that by mid-1992, their marriage had completely fallen apart. At that point, Wallace had already been discharged from the U.S. Navy following repeated disciplinary issues and struggles with drug use. The breakdown of his marriage coincided with his growing instability, financial, emotional, and psychological. By the time the divorce was finalized, Wallace had returned to Charlotte, North Carolina, alone and adrift, beginning the period that would lead directly into his first confirmed murder that same year. This breakup could potentially have been the trigger that set him on a descent into darkness. Shauna Denise Hawk was born in 1972, the beloved daughter of Anna and Daryl Hawk, and from the start she was the kind of young woman who left an impression wherever she went. Growing up in Charlotte, she carried herself with warmth and gentleness, a spirit that drew people in. Friends and family described her as kind-hearted, cheerful, and deeply caring, the type of person who lifted others with her presence. Her parents nurtured her in a home filled with love, faith, and guidance, giving her the foundation to grow into a thoughtful young adult. By the early 1990s, Shauna was stepping into her independence.
Please help us make 1,000 subscribers by the year end. Make sure to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and leave comments down below so I can find out what content you'd like to see, and I will reply to everyone. Don't forget to hit the bell to be notified as soon as the next video drops.
She enrolled at Central Piedmont Community College, determined to pursue her education and build a meaningful career. She also worked part-time at a local fast food restaurant, balancing her studies with her job, just as so many young people do when they are finding their way. Outside of work and school, Shauna was known as someone who was always ready to help others, a loyal friend and a devoted daughter. On February 19, 1993, Shauna's life took a turn that no one could have anticipated. It was an ordinary day, one filled with the usual rhythm of work and home. That evening, she returned to her mother's house, a place that had always been a safe haven. Hours passed, and when Shauna's family tried to reach her, silence answered instead of her familiar voice. Concern began to grow. Later that night, her mother came home and felt something was wrong the moment she walked through the door. The house was too still, too quiet. As she moved through the rooms, searching for her daughter, she found Shauna submerged in the bathtub. The shock of that discovery was indescribable. Police were called immediately, and officers rushed to the scene. What they found was devastating. Shauna had been strangled, her life taken in the very place she should have felt most secure. Detectives began their work, documenting the home, searching for clues, trying to piece together how such a terrible act had unfolded within those familiar walls. For her family, however, the scene was beyond comprehension. The safe and loving home they had built now carried the weight of tragedy. Shauna's story is one of a young woman with dreams, kindness, and a future that was never given the chance to bloom. Her loss was not only a private heartbreak for her family, but also a chilling reminder to the community of how fragile safety can be.
Audrey Ann Spain was born in 1971, a daughter raised with love and high hopes by her family in North Carolina. From the beginning, she carried with her a light that made her stand out, thoughtful, ambitious, and determined to carve a path for herself in the world. Growing up through the late 1970s and 80s, Audrey was shaped by an era of big dreams. It was a time when opportunities for young women were opening up more than ever before, and she wanted to seize her share of them. Friends and family remembered Audrey as someone full of energy and kindness, with a drive that made her well-suited for the working world she was preparing to enter. By the early 1990s, she was building her independence in Charlotte, a city that seemed alive with possibility. Charlotte was booming then, its banking towers rising tall, a symbol of modern progress. Yet beneath the shine, life for many young adults like Audrey meant juggling school or ambitions with jobs that kept the bills paid. For her, one of those jobs was working at a local Taco Bell restaurant. On June 23, 1993, Audrey was expected at work, but she never arrived. To her colleagues, it was unusual. Audrey was not the type to miss a shift without a call, and her absence stirred unease. That unease grew into alarm when hours passed without word. Friends reached out, her family worried, and the silence became heavy. It was police officers who finally made the discovery. Responding to calls of concern, they went to Audrey's apartment. The quiet inside was thick, the kind of stillness that speaks louder than words. When they entered, they found her body lying on the floor. Audrey had been strangled. The scene bore the unmistakable marks of violence. Detectives worked methodically, documenting the apartment with cameras and notes, collecting evidence, trying to reconstruct the last moments of a young woman whose life had ended far too soon. For them, it was more than another case. It was the tragic story of a life stopped in its prime, of a daughter, a friend, a hard-working young woman who had so much more ahead of her. For her family, the news was shattering. Audrey had set out into the world full of determination and promise, only to be met with cruelty in the very place she should have been safe, her own home. For Charlotte, her death was another ripple of unease, another reminder that something dark was stalking the city's most vulnerable. Audrey Spain's story is not only one of loss, but also of remembrance. She was more than the scene of her discovery. She was a young woman who laughed, dreamed, worked hard, and loved deeply. To honor her memory is to refuse to let her be reduced to a name in a file. It is to remember the fullness of her humanity.
In the story of American true crime, few names stir the same chilling mix of curiosity and disbelief as Henry Louis Wallace, the man the media would later dub the Charlotte Strangler. To understand how he emerged from obscurity to become one of the most infamous figures of the 1990s, we must begin with his birth, his upbringing, and the world that surrounded him during his formative years. Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4, 1965, in Barnwell, South Carolina, a small rural town where opportunities were limited and the weight of history pressed heavily on every household. The mid-1960s in America was a period of turbulence and transformation. The civil rights movement was forcing the country to confront centuries of inequality, and the South in particular was still grappling with the aftermath of segregation. In Barnwell, the economic landscape offered little promise. Jobs were scarce, and those available were often low-paying, leaving families caught in cycles of hardship. Wallace was raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide, but the absence of a father figure created a void that shaped his earliest perceptions of family, responsibility, and belonging. As he grew, Wallace was known for his quiet demeanor, yet beneath that surface, there were already signs of struggles brewing. He attended local schools during a time when the education system in many southern communities was underfunded and strained, making it easy for young people to slip through unnoticed. Teachers described him as intelligent, but he lacked direction. He participated in extracurricular activities, and at first glance seemed like a young man with potential. But discipline was a recurring problem. In the wider context of the 1970s and early 1980s, America was experiencing waves of social change, from the aftermath of Vietnam to the rise of urban crime, the explosion of drugs in poorer neighborhoods, and the ongoing battles for equality. Wallace's adolescence unfolded against this backdrop of instability and shifting values, and his own personal insecurities seemed to mirror the confusion of the era. By the time he reached young adulthood, Wallace's life was marked by a pattern of contradictions. Outwardly, he could appear charming and sociable, the kind of person others felt comfortable around. Inwardly, however, he was restless and unsettled. He joined the Navy, a decision that many young men from small southern towns made as a means to escape poverty and find structure. The Navy offered him discipline, travel, and exposure to life outside of Barnwell, but it also introduced him to struggles with authority and further deepened his complex relationship with rules and responsibility. His military career was brief, punctuated by infractions and a lack of commitment. After leaving, he drifted through jobs and relationships, never quite finding the stability or satisfaction he seemed to crave. The 1980s and early 1990s in America were defined by rapid technological progress, economic recessions, and an evolving social landscape. In the South, industries were shifting, jobs in small towns were disappearing, and urban centers were becoming magnets for those seeking opportunity. Charlotte, North Carolina, where Wallace would eventually settle, embodied this change. It was a growing city, proud of its modern skyline and thriving banking industry. But beneath its polished image lay neighborhoods where poverty, addiction, and vulnerability thrived. It was in this environment that Wallace's darker tendencies began to take shape, as the combination of his fractured upbringing, failed attempts at structure, and unresolved personal turmoil set the stage for the choices he would later make. The story of Henry Louis Wallace's early years is not one of inevitable evil, but rather of opportunities missed, supports absent, and an environment that seemed to leave cracks in his foundation. His life reminds us that the path a person walks is often influenced by forces both within and outside their control. The home they are born into, the society that surrounds them, and the choices they make when faced with hardship. And so, as we reflect on this chapter of his life, the moral becomes clear. Every child's environment matters, every absence leaves an imprint, and every community bears responsibility for the futures it shapes. For in the silence of neglect, shadows can grow, and in the absence of guidance, the wrong paths can appear deceptively easy to follow. Valencia Juniper was born in 1973, a bright, ambitious young woman whose life reflected all the optimism and energy of her generation. She grew up in a loving family that believed in hard work, education, and faith, values that shaped her from an early age. From childhood, Valencia was the kind of person who left an impression wherever she went. She was soft-spoken yet confident, deeply caring toward others, and determined to make something of herself in a world that often tested young women's resolve. By the early 1990s, she was studying at Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the city's most respected historically Black universities. She was pursuing her education with passion and drive, balancing her studies with part-time work while keeping close ties to her family and friends. Valencia had the kind of spirit that drew people in, vibrant, intelligent, and full of warmth. Her friends admired her ambition. She dreamed of a future filled with possibility. Charlotte at that time was buzzing with change, growing from a regional hub into one of the South's most promising cities. For young people like Valencia, it felt like a place of opportunity. The world seemed open, her path just beginning. But beneath the surface of that promise, danger was quietly moving through the same city streets, unseen and unsuspected. On August 10, 1993, the Charlotte Fire Department received a call about an apartment fire. Flames had engulfed a unit in a quiet residential complex on the city's south side. When firefighters arrived, thick smoke poured from the windows, and the air smelled of burning cloth and plastic. They worked quickly to douse the blaze, their boots crunching over shattered glass and scorched debris as the flames finally gave way to darkness and steam. Inside, amid the ashes, they found the body of a young woman, later identified as 20-year-old Valencia Juniper. At first, it appeared that the fire had been accidental, perhaps caused by a kitchen mishap or electrical fault. But as investigators examined the scene more closely, something about it didn't feel right. The burn patterns seemed inconsistent, the damage too deliberate. The autopsy would reveal a grim truth. Valencia had been strangled before the fire ever began. The blaze was no accident. It had been set intentionally, an attempt to destroy evidence and conceal a crime. The revelation sent shockwaves through her community. To those who knew Valencia, the news was devastating. How could something so cruel happen to someone so full of life and promise? She was the type of young woman who inspired others, who spoke of her dreams with quiet confidence and chased them with determination. Now, her laughter, her presence, her future, all of it, was gone. For detectives, the case marked another grim mystery in a growing string of tragedies that had begun to unsettle Charlotte. Yet even then, few realized that these deaths were not isolated, that a single thread connected them all, one that would only become clear with time. Valencia Juniper's story is one of brilliance extinguished far too soon. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a student.
The year end. Make sure to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and leave comments down below so I can find out what content you'd like to see, and I will reply to everyone. Don't forget to hit the bell to be notified as soon as the next video drops.
A dreamer. Her life reminds us how fragile safety can be and how easily trust can be misplaced in the ordinary corners of life. And for viewers hearing her story today, her memory stands as a quiet testament to the importance of vigilance, of protecting one another, and of remembering that behind every headline lies a life once filled with light, love, and purpose.